Good evening, everybody. I'm going to try to leave this on there. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me tonight. I'm a little bit surprised because I don't have nearly the history that a lot of people here have with the community, but I'm very honored to have been invited here. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me. I wanted to start off with a personal observation. It seems to me that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what being trans is, and when I mention that word, most people probably most people probably think about some sort of surgery, as if surgical intervention defines being trans. But the most fundamental aspect of medical intervention sought by trans persons is often simply hormone adjustment. Our healthcare also often encompasses mental health services, and although many folks attribute this um, to dealing with personal issues of gender identity, it's more likely that a majority of counseling needs stem from the stress and that accompanies the incredible stigma that society has for trans identities. Um, for trans persons, their honest gender identity is a most precious and valued possession. The difficulty comes from outside forces that deny our effort to embrace our identity. The social stigma is an enormous weight. Around 40% of trans persons attempt suicide at some point in their life. To put that into perspective, only about 1.5 to 3% of the general population attempt suicide. My first direct encounter with the issue of suicide was at a Creating Change conference, the one in Dallas here in 2010, where I had volunteered to help host the Trans Hospitality Suite. We generally had about 10 to 15 trans and genderqueer persons there in the evenings, chatting, playing games, or just relaxing. One night was distinctly different. A big announcement was going to be made, and the rumor was that it had something to do with the status of the Federal Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or ENDA. For a little background on this, just 3 years earlier, in 2007, there had been a prior version of ENDA before Congress, and during negotiations, protections covering gender identity and expression were dropped. When it came out that gender identity had been dropped from the bill, the trans community was disappointed, to say the least. Betrayal might be a better description. ENDA was introduced again in late 2009, and the trans community was looking for news to indicate whether we would be included or not going forward. The stories and rumors went both ways. Some said gender identity would again be dropped to increase chances of passing, while other reports were that this time it would remain all-inclusive. Still, other rumors conveyed that ENDA was stalled and would not be going anywhere regardless. But everyone in the Creating Change Trans Hospitality room that night was optimistic. You could feel the energy when Mara Kiesling, who's director of the National Center for Transgender Equality, started to talk. I don't remember much of what Mara said during her fairly long impromptu speech that evening. I imagine she talked a little bit about ENDA's history, the struggles to include gender identity coverage, and the difficulties with getting those outside the trans community to listen to trans concerns. I remember her talking louder over the increasing noise and finally hollering to be heard when she got to the point of saying that she had good sources assuring her that ENDA was moving forward and that this time it would be and would remain trans inclusive. Everyone was cheering. I tried to listen, but wasn't wholly there. Another event was playing out in a back room we had closed off to keep it somewhat quiet and private. An hour or so before, when the suite was almost empty, the host there began working to address a potential suicide. A friend had noted that one of the guests, a young trans woman of about 20, whom I'll call Anne, had been off to one side by herself. She had been pretty gregarious on prior nights, so this seemed unusual. My friend moved closer and was able to hear Anne mutter something like, "Tonight's the night." She could also see that Anne had scratched or cut her forearm and was bleeding. The friend let me and the other hosts know, and while the other hosts talked with Ann, I ran to find a counselor. Thanks to the excellent folks volunteering and on staff who immediately lit up several cell phones to find the closest counselor, we had someone up there speaking with her in less than half an hour, probably more like 20 minutes. While I was listening to Mara talk about Enda and watching the crowd in the room react, I kept wondering what was going on in the room where Ann and the counselor were talking in the relative quiet. They were there a long time, and while I don't remember any specific words that Mara said, I still remember the words of the counselor when the door finally opened and he came out. We have a way forward. She's going to be okay. We have a plan and we have a way to move forward. I started taking steps to come out at work the next month. It was my way to honor those words and to move forward. I worked at the public library then, the Dallas Downtown Library, and was asked to edit a form for a youth poetry contest. And one of my comments was, do we really need to know a student's gender for them to enter a poetry contest? That could discourage transgender and intersex children from entering. Of course, entering the poetry contest was not the most significant impact I felt the question could have, but I thought that could open a conversation. The response from a usually very verbose colleague was brief and did not open a conversation. It read only, "I'll forward the appropriate comments." When I was asked to code the final version of the form for our website, my suggested grammatical changes had been made, but the gender marker question remained. I knew which comment was not considered appropriate. Over the next year, I helped address 2 more suicide attempts. Thankfully, that is the extent of my career in this type of crisis intervention. I also found a way to work around that colleague, and today, because I found a strong advocate in administration, there is no gender question on the youth poetry entry form, and as I understand, that question won't be on any similar form unless it's absolutely necessary. I suppose it may be a little bit confusing that I talk about a gender marker on a contest entry form together with suicide, but I do that because they're linked. What may seem to many like connecting a trivial item to a serious topic such as self-harm illustrates something that I feel is one of those deeply felt aspects of trans experience and why I started the organization I work with. I can't speak for all trans persons in our extremely diverse community, but I have found that in being honest with myself in terms of gender identity, I am placed in opposition to a pervasive social power that tells me I am in fact being dishonest. As trans persons, we are often told that our most fundamental and hard-won truth about ourselves is actually a lie. This is conveyed through the words people use, through their actions to deny our identity, and through so many structural elements like little checkboxes on forms that are intended to be X'd according to that initial X provided on a birth certificate a few seconds after we are born. I mentioned that my career in crisis intervention has been short-lived, and that is technically true, but I also think that I'm working in the field every day. It's my job now. When the organization tries to expand health care to trans and gender nonconforming persons, when we advocate for a trans person who is seeking shelter, when we are in the future have a community center and a shelter that focuses on meeting the needs of trans and gender nonconforming persons, and when we take part in organizations that have no other trans participation or representation, whenever we can openly, as trans persons, show we have more to offer than just a confrontation with cultural definitions of honesty. When we do these things, we help address the root of that stigma. We help reduce the need for the individual screams of self-harm and for the hope, and we hope that we help convert the concept of birth certificate-based dishonesty to one of appreciation for the integrity it takes to find this kind of truth. Personally, I think the Dallas Way has invited me here too early, and as I really haven't done that much yet, and most of what I'm doing is not very successful yet, but I hope that I can live up to this invitation in the future. I'm proud to be a participant in a community, an LGBTIQA, etc. community that is showing greater willingness to act together, out and proud, to address these issues. And this encourages me to feel that, like that counselor said to the young woman at Creating Change, I and we as a community, we have a plan and we have a way to move forward. Thank you.